Welcome to Disarming Leviathan, a podcast designed to equip you to missionally engage American Christian nationalists. For more info on today's guest and our suite of resources, visit disarmingleviathan.com.
Angela, a while back you wrote a book, Red State Christians. You were kind enough to come on this podcast and share about that. You've just come out with a new book, Disciples of White Jesus, 8 years later. Tell us from your perspective, what has shifted in American Christian nationalism and in the broader American culture as you've been paying attention?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time, so I will try not to belabor this. But I will say, I feel like every time you and I talk, I feel worse initially, and then I feel better at the end. So here's a
I
promise
think
for
that's
everybody.
good. Is that good?
It's very like Lutheran, like the gospel first kills you, and then it
There you
resurrects
go.
you.
Yes, there you go.
So I mean, everything has changed. I myself personally have changed, I think, in where I'm finding sources of hope, and also in my. I think one of the biggest things that has changed for me is initially I had much more hope about redeeming a lot of the conservative Christian spaces that I had found helpful and fruitful in my own life. And as these last several years have passed, I've seen much of what was like redeeming and fruitful and connected to the gospel, to Jesus' mission in those spaces become increasingly sidelined and replaced with this full-throated commitment, not only to Christian nationalism and sort of America as an idol, but also sort of crowding out the flag and the military as the key idols are individuals such as Donald Trump, such as Elon Musk, such as JD Vance, and a lot of the sort of characters that make up the Disciples of White Jesus in my news story. So that's, I think, one of the biggest shifts is that we've seen like this sort of soft Christian nationalism to a really commitment to a hard Christian nationalism intrinsically connected to authoritarian government.
What is, from your perspective, what's the reason for that shift? To shift from, singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee" and church on Sunday and American flag and God has a special relationship with America to Donald J. Trump is the Lord's anointed to redeem and restore God's country in America. How did what's going on that's making that shift?
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned Trump's words, I was really struck by that. So I write columns for our local Minneapolis newspaper, and they had asked me to watch Trump's speech a few nights ago here in March, and I noticed he said that explicitly. He said, "I believe God has saved me to make America great again." Yeah. So certainly the assassination attempts were a key moment in Trump sort of personally seizing this messianic mantle. But I think what also, if you're asking for reasons for why it's gone this way, I'll say it's pursuit of power and it's anxiety about losing power and losing position. But more critically, the two words that I keep returning to again and again when we're understanding the motivations and reasons why this movement has been so sticky is two things: money and media. So they've got a lot of big dollar donors who are pouring a lot of money into, and also, there's a lot of money to be made the more extreme content you're pushing out there. The algorithms really prize that kind of content. And then advertisers are more likely to advertise when there's extreme content. So that is all connected by money and media. And I think those two things have really fueled this movement to its more extreme parts. To what end, we're still waiting to see.
Yeah. So in Red State Christians, you spent a lot of time in different communities across the country, seeing how mostly evangelicals, but some other denominations within Christianity were responding to the MAGA movement, propagating the MAGA movement. Now we're seeing, and what I'm hearing you saying is it's really sharpened around specific people, leaders. Thinking spiritually about that, help us frame this from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because that's what I think gets missed sometimes in national media reporting about this movement. And for me, as a Lutheran pastor and as a trained theologian, I really think it's central. So, this new book that I have, 2 of the first chapters focus on how people within this movement view God and how they view Jesus. And a lot of that is groundwork that's been being laid for decades. And much of it, you and I grew up with as young adults. And hearing these critiques of the church that it had become too feminine, that Jesus was too soft, that we needed to bring men back into the church. Now, interestingly, like we're seeing that reflected numerically in polling data that record numbers of women are leaving the church, which is not hugely surprising in an age of unveiling of more abuse crises within the church. And young men are maybe starting to come back to religion. But I think that is reflective more of where the church has changed and in what, how appealing a hierarchical place is to the young men that I'm studying in this book.
What is it, do you think, that's so appealing? I have noticed, as you have, I'm a evangelical insider, and I've noticed that much of the growth inside evangelicalism, at least in my region, has been inside places that are explicitly advocating for Christian nationalism. Some of these congregations they're saying out loud and in public, our growth model is to lean into our partnership with a purveyor of Christian nationalism. And we used to be a couple hundred people, now we're 2,000 people. And there's a bunch of new megachurches in the Valley that are engaging in a posture of culture war, masculinity defined in a certain way, what I would call fear mongering about them, whoever they are. And I've also seen a growth in curiosity around Eastern Orthodox traditions, which is hierarchical, patriarchal, ritualistic, masculine. At least that's what I'm hearing. Is it that young men are having a spiritual awakening to the way of Jesus? Or is it that young men are looking for a way to be a man and that the Jesus bit is thrown in there secondarily? What's your take on it?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's the second part because, as is really clear in the reporting I did for my first book, churches have been very complicit in what a lot of Southern Baptist pastors called, for me, a gospel distortion, in which the gospel of Christian nationalism has crowded out the gospel of Jesus. And I also have done a lot of reporting on traditional Catholicism and on the trads before trad wives were cool a few years ago. Did some reporting for U.S. Catholic on the trads and my work on Catholics in red state Christians. And I do think it's really important to study these movements in concert because it is an appeal to an explicit hierarchy. And I was just talking with a Baptist pastor earlier this week, and he was telling me that was one of the surprises that he had seen is that, here Baptists historically had been a very anti-hierarchical movement.
Yeah.
And folks that he went to seminary with, he saw them, this is 5-10 years ago, seeking out hierarchical church bodies and maybe becoming Anglican because they were looking for the hierarchy that they couldn't explicitly. And so this pastor was like, gosh, if you're feeling like, the Southern Baptists with their umbrella of authority with men at the top are not hierarchical enough for you, what is it you're really seeking out? Because certainly Jesus upset a lot of hierarchies. Jesus was crucified by the Roman Empire because he was not, he was some sort of assumed threat to their hierarchy and to the allegiance of religious leaders in Jerusalem to the Roman Empire. So again, that's why, my book's called White Jesus, because we're making a distinction between the historical Jesus, the Jesus of the Bible, and this creation of who Jesus is in order to prop up human hierarchy and power and money.
Help us understand that a bit more. We hear phrases like white Christian nationalism, whiteness. You've titled the book "White Disciples of White Jesus." What do you mean by white Jesus?
Yeah, I will say that, I was initially reluctant to use that phraseology because for some people it can feel like, you just want white people to feel guilty or
Sure.
you're trying to, there's so much rhetoric out there right now that's being purported by the Trump administration, like looking to attack things like diversity movements. And so I was initially reluctant, and I still kept getting the question when I would tell people, hey, I'm doing this project about boys and men and Christianity and radicalization. And I can't tell you how many people would ask me, people who are not connected to the church, people who don't have religious commitments would say, oh, are you going to talk about white Jesus? And what is meant by white Jesus is, in some ways, the Jesus that I grew up with up here in very white Scandinavian Minnesota, the Jesus we saw on our stained glass, the Jesus we saw within our traditional mainline congregations with flowing blonde hair, also depicted as, muscular and militant. It's a media creation in some ways, a creation of the European church in order to make Jesus European initially, I think, and to support things like the Crusades, to support things like the Roman Catholic Church, which was the largest landowner in medieval Europe. And I always try to make these connections for people with what's happening in America now. Because in some ways, I think it's important to take our understanding of what's happening out of the immediate partisan context and to say, Christian nationalism is not a creation of American Democrats at all. In many ways, they've been complicit in it as well. But instead, this is a much longer story about what happens when Christianity gets entangled with powerful people in government and politics. And what happens is people die, there's wars, and genuine faith becomes compromised. So maybe it's my German Reformation ancestry that's talking here, but I definitely think it's really relevant to what's happening here. We see so many parallels, this creation of Jesus as distinct from who Jesus really was, which was a Middle Eastern man who spent his time with folks from a lot of different religious traditions who, J.D. Vance saw this, who his neighbor was, as something very expansive outside his immediate contact, who even warned his followers, you may have to go against your own family. You may have to go against what you've known in order to follow me. So I think we have to know our scripture and know our history in order to really understand what's happening today.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this line that Jesus uses in Matthew 24 where he talks about how there'll be false messiahs and false prophets who come and they're deceiving the elect, if that's possible, it says. And one of the ways that seems to be manifest is the false messiah is not always a completely different entity. Sometimes it's a version of the real messiah that's slightly distorted. Like what you're saying, like the militant Jesus. Yeah, like 80% of it's Jesus, and then there's this 20% deviation. And so you take the energy of someone's devotion to Jesus, and you shift it ever so slightly in your own direction with just a slight distortion that usually, I think, is found in the means by which you're trying to obtain good ends.
Yeah.
And yeah, good.
No, I was just thinking when you're saying this, it was reminding me of something I read this morning that was talking about, and I think it's such a critical thing for understanding where we are right now, is that people are using words to mean their very opposite.
Yeah,
And they're very much accusing others of doing what they themselves are doing. So, there's a lot of calling others Nazis, calling others fascists,
Yes.
to cover over ideologies and beliefs that have connections to historical Nazi movements or have connections to historically fascist movements. And I think a similar thing is happening with Jesus himself. There's genuinely sort of a battle going on right now to determine the identity of Jesus for American Christians. And white Jesus team from my sports analogy days is winning. Like we're like third quarter here. And the movement of white Jesus to define who American Christians worship is certainly winning.
Yeah. So, from your perspective, why do you think so many political leaders are leveraging white Jesus?
Money and media.
Okay, say more about that.
Yes. Yeah, th- I'm always intrigued by noticing how obsessed many politicians are with their social media follower counts. Like they know exactly how many folks follow them on social media. They know exactly what's happening online. And I think the pandemic really exacerbated this with the amount of time that everybody was spending online. And JD Vance is, I feel like I should just put him on the cover of my book. Because he's such a great example. And it's actually, it's kind of a sad story in some ways. He's the same age as I am. He's coming out of the Rust Belt. I mean, there's much about his story that could have gone a different way. But so they're embracing this movement because for lack of something more significant, it's going to get them likes and attention. And also, American politics has been dominated by money in politics for a long time and by lobbying and lobbyists. And in order to get things done, you've got to have the patronage of very wealthy people. And as pastors who, are trying to run churches, that's also something that happens in churches, when it comes to just simply keeping things going, and especially with the church growth movement, as some churches took on more and more building debt. So it's just become, there's this like beast that everybody keeps feeding, which maybe is unfettered capitalism, but it's this beast that everyone keeps feeding and seeking. How do I feed this beast? And I think politicians too have gotten caught up in that, where if I embrace this movement, I know that there are donors who are going to like what I'm saying. I know Trump himself is going to like what I'm saying. Maybe I'm going to get on Fox News. Maybe I'm going to go viral. And that's going to be my ticket into more and more power and privilege. And if I don't do it, if I embrace something else, if I critique it, then I'm going to be set upon by the online mob. Yeah. Then I'm going to have death threats. Then I'm going to lose my job. Then I'm going to, have these debts called in that I probably owe. So it's a symptom of economic precarity, and general social unease, and a lack of genuine community connections that would alleviate some of that sense of anxiety or loss of sense of place.
Yeah. So we see this version of white Jesus being leveraged by political leaders to, it seems to me, to gain allegiance from those who follow Jesus. And you are looking at how this is impacting future generations. Talk to us about what compelled you to write about not only disciples of white Jesus in general, but also your subtitle, The Radicalization of American Boyhood.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a distinction that I always want to make too is like, well, I'm very frustrated by the ways in which money and power and pursuit of media stardom have corrupted folks that have a lot of power and influence politically or religiously in this country. Um, there's also a whole generation of men and boys who are sort of getting caught in the chaos and getting caught um, in this battle. And there's a lot of collateral damage, if you will, that's happening among young boys and men. So I guess the principal motivation for me is as a mom and as a wife in some ways too, watching and seeing what is happening as we're raising boys in this atmosphere. And what I'll tell you is, like, as I started doing this work and talking about these issues more, no matter where I am, whatever kind of context I'm in, whether it's rural, urban, blue, red, everybody has a story about a boy or a young man in their life who they're worried about, whether it's from online radicalization or a search for identity or sort of this miasmic, like, failure to launch sort of thing that people have in mind. We certainly see it in schools. And one thing that I find myself talking about again and again is there's almost been this taboo on even talking about boys and men in a lot of progressive or even corporate spaces. Um, and what that has done is create a vacuum of content where, like, the only content that you're finding about boys and men is coming from the manosphere.
Yeah.
And, you know, the other thing I saw over and over again is that, and I see this even with, like, my own boys and their YouTube viewing habits. Um, a lot of times boys and young men will start watching some of these guys almost as a joke, and they'll do it as a group. And they'll be like, oh, this guy's so nuts. Like, let's watch this video and make fun of him, and we're going to mock him. But what happens is the algorithm doesn't know if you're watching a video to mock it or you're watching it genuinely. And so the algorithm keeps serving up more and more of this extreme content, pushing towards Andrew Tate, pushing towards guys like that. Uh, and inevitably, maybe you get cut from a team. Maybe you're going through a breakup. Maybe you're on the outs with your friends and you're alone, but what is in front of you is your phone. And you pull up YouTube and you've been watching this content with your friends to make fun of it. And now it's just in front of you. And somebody's telling you, oh, are you feeling rejected? Are you feeling left out? Like, do girls not like you? This is how to be a man. This is how you're going to, find community. This is how you're going to be strong and powerful. And like 8 times out of 10, there is a religious component to that message. Whether or not this is being served to boys who are connected to a church, who come from a religious family, who may be of other faith groups, a lot of times there is this Christian connection that I think we can't not talk about when we're talking about, like, the manosphere. Even for people who would say they're not faith-based, there is a connection to right-wing Christianity within it all.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things we've noticed even in this last election, many of the folks who voted for Trump, the MAGA movement, had grown up in that atmosphere. They're 10 years old, I think, if I'm doing the math right, when he was first elected. And so, if their first vote is there, you're thinking about longer term discipleship than just being swayed by a particular campaign. There's ongoing formation that's happening. What were some of the things that you noticed? I mean, you've shared much of it in your book, but just thinking about what's happening to American boys that's radicalizing them. What are some of the things you're noticing, and what are some of the things that we can do to help?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I think influenced some of that, and certainly this election, and sort of the Democrats' inability to connect in many ways with Gen Z men, is that there was almost this, from the perspective of Democrats or from the left, there was almost this idolization of Gen Z. And there was a lack of, there was this, for me as a millennial, even from like a fashion sense, it was like, oh, we've all got to do what the Gen Zs are doing, and we've got to adapt their slang, and we've got to do the middle part, and we've got to get rid of our skinny jeans, which I was happy to do. I don't know if all the megachurch pastors have gotten on that boat yet. I think they're still doing the skinny jeans, but
so it would seem.
Yeah. But so there was this like very surface level understanding of who young people were, and there was an inability to really look and listen at a population level, especially to young men and to boys. There was sort of just this blanket view of, oh, Gen Z, they're so progressive, they're so hip, they're like so, they have such a large proportion of folks who are LGBTQ. And there was a real almost like infantilizing of Gen Z and an inability to like listen to folks who were actually speaking from that generation. And so I think as a result, we had a lot of voices from Gen Z that weren't being heard. And when people's voices are not being heard, or when they see themselves depicted as something other than the way they understand themselves to be, they're going to react by rejecting whatever movement is in power politically, or, and they're going to go towards what they might perceive as something that is going to give them a chance to determine who they are. So I think there's that part with Gen Z that I just think there was a real lack of understanding of the depth and breadth of who boys and men were within Gen Z. And I think I have a whole chapter on schools and education in my book too. And I think that's a key place where we see some of these trends being laid out. Is there's been a movement of which I'm supportive of to expand, like, what does femininity look like and how can femininity be strong? And there has been almost zero corresponding movement to redefine maybe what masculinity looks like.
Yeah.
Is it okay to be emotional as a man and beyond just sort of performative tears, but like, is it okay to be empathetic? Is it weak to be empathetic? There's just been very little conversation about masculinity at all. And I see it with my boys too. They're now 12 and 9, and I see the ways in which we still have traditional old-fashioned ideas about the responsibilities of masculinity that don't make a lot of sense in a 2025 context. And are, to try to be a sole provider for a family in 2025 America is setting up a lot of young men for failure. Yeah. It's just economically not realistic. But that's still the version of masculinity that many of them are being handed down, even in what we might call progressive spaces.
Yeah. There also does seem to be in some spaces, a pressure, or how shall I say, that you should be ashamed of yourself for being a white male. Look at all these things white men have done that's horrible. Chattel slavery, denying women the right to vote. Here's all these history lessons about where white men are the problem. And when you're a 16-year-old, like white dude growing up, if there's not positive expressions that you can look to move towards, in that vacuum easily swoops in toxic expressions because it's the only thing available to you. Do you see that phenomenon happening more broadly in America?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of it, and it's one of those things that's like really difficult to talk about because it exists in the same country in which white men still do hold most of the positions of power and leadership and wealth in this country. And I actually think that the bigger, broader story there is, the surface level sort of corporate, just sort of cheap talk about diversity or about anti-racism, and sort of a lot of movements that consider anti-racism or feminism to be sort of tokenizing individuals rather than looking at real systemic change. I think the right has really pounced on that and said, oh, well, we can do that too, you know? Because if you're not fundamentally going to look at changing any of that, then it is very confusing for boys to hear, oh, I'm the problem, but also people who look like me are still achieving all this and getting all this. So like, where do I fit it?
Yeah.
Then I personally must just really suck.
Yeah. Right.
Because there's still this happening, but I'm also being told this is bad. And I also think too, just in general, the sort of group of, and I really write about this in Red State Christians, like the groupification of identity politics.
Yeah.
You know, identity politics used to be like the provision of the left or of Democrats. And I think now it's Republicans who have seized on identity politics. And none of it is helpful. You know,
Right.
None of it is addressing the real concerns that we saw again in the 2024 election around affordability, around the loss of a middle-class American dream, around sort of this inability to find reliable truth in media organizations that are increasingly dominated by billionaires. Nobody is really addressing any of that stuff, and people are frustrated and cynical and nihilistic and also susceptible to a movement that's a little bit cult-like in its promises.
Yeah. Yeah. So your book covers a few different stories about how the white Jesus discipleship has impacted boys, many of them now men in America. What are some of the things you learned in this process, and specifically thinking about those of us who are parents of American boys? Not only what have you learned, but how would you give us some coaching on things we can do to help as we move forward?
Yeah, I was really careful to explain in this book why I thought story was the way to do this. Because I think that there's this tendency to look for policy solutions and look for, graphs and charts and sort of sorting people into different subgroups with catchy names and like how. And I just don't think that any of that has really been shown to move the needle. And especially as a parent, that can feel overwhelming. And also, as a parent, the things that I see make the biggest difference in my kids' lives are their relationships and the stories that they tell about the world and about themselves. And also, ultimately, for me as a pastor, if I want to help people to grow in their faith, I'm going to do it through the story of Jesus and through the stories of the Bible, and not through, well, if you follow Jesus, then you can expect this return on your investment, which
Right.
is a way that much of Christianity approaches it. So the book begins with a really tough story, and that is tracing part of the journey of Dylann Roof, who was a white supremacist mass shooter who committed a massacre at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, which is one of the oldest and most formidable Black churches in this country. And he killed 9 people there after sitting with them in Bible study for an hour.
Yeah.
But part of the reason that I chose Dylann Roof to begin the book with is that, many people from the outside hearing the story of Dylann Roof and how he was radicalized into white supremacy online principally, they would assume, if you ask, well, what was his faith background, that he came out of conservative evangelicalism. But Dylann Roof didn't. He was brought up in a mainline ELCA Lutheran congregation, which is the same denomination where I've spent much of my life and where I've been a pastor for the past 12 years. So it was important for me to begin in that space, both to go to Charleston to pay my respects at Mother Emanuel, but also to go to Columbia, South Carolina, to the church where Dylann grew up, and to help people to see that because I think there's such a tendency for everyone to want to go, well, these troublesome trends are happening somewhere else.
Yeah. Right.
If we just address what's happening somewhere else,
Right.
then everything's going to be better. But that's not true. Like I said, everybody has a story. And so I wanted to investigate this place where Dylann was formed in his faith, where his family had been a part of the congregation for a long time, and also to speak with his pastor. And I just had this incredibly powerful conversation with his pastor, both expressing sort of his guilt and regret and helplessness in the face of what had happened, his wrestling with everything going on in America, the history of South Carolina itself, and also wrestling with the interconnectedness at the root of so many of these stories, which is that not only was Dylann Roof one of his parishioners and his family as his parishioners, but also that the pastor at Mother Emanuel, Clement Pinckney, was also someone who this pastor knew and had a relationship with and had made ashes with together for Ash Wednesday. And so for that beginning story to frame the whole work, I just want to help parents to understand helping our kids to get through this time is partly realizing that we are all interconnected, that they're, and it's a hard truth as a parent to think that like we can't separate and create this safe world for our kids where they're not going to be affected by any of this. But I think if that's kind of your starting point is, okay, even if I get rid of all processed foods and I follow all of the Make America Healthy Again guidelines and I do like my kids are not going to be safe by that, then it opens the door to, okay, how are my kids going to be safe in community? What is the role of my faith in that? How do I raise my kids that the questions they ask are okay, the emotions they feel are okay, whoever they are is okay, as long as they are respecting themselves, respecting others, respecting God. And I think the identity piece, the formation of identity, especially in our boys and in our sons, is a really key piece here because a lot of boys are empathetic, are emotional, are, different than I don't think anybody conforms to this ideal standard of masculinity that people have made in their heads. I've worked with a bunch of professional athletes. They don't see themselves in that standard, even if they're amazing athletes. So how do we help the boys in our lives? And even, for those of us who are married to men, like how do we help our husbands to embrace the side of them that's empathetic, embrace the side of them that listens, is quiet, is calmer, and also embrace the side that's loud and wants to be physical and wants to move around. Like, I think all of that can be done too in pointing to other stories. And that's why the book ends with stories of boys who found their way out and found their way into a different vision of masculinity that comported with a God who loved them through it all.
So if you were to give one practical thing that we could do as parents in this next season, what would it be?
You're asking me to be practical, and I'm a pastor and a journalist. Really, I'm not
Come on, help me fix it.
I did marry an engineer, so that part was practical. No, the thing my mind really first went to was, especially for parents who are Christians, to teach your boys the story of Jesus' deep sorrow and weeping at the death of his friend, and how that was a moment when Jesus, like, that was the precursor to Jesus then resurrecting Lazarus from the dead. That there is this power in expressing empathy for others. And in a world when we have a book that's a bestseller about toxic empathy, I think that opening that door, that practical piece of just helping your kids to see the strength in empathy for others is a huge first step.
Yeah.
And that would be my biggest piece of practical advice. And I don't know, practically buy my book, buy your book.
Yes. Wherever fine books are sold, you too can fix this problem. Yeah. Good. Well, Angela, thank you so much for this, for your work. I've benefited greatly from it. and I'm so thankful for it. Where can people find you and your work?
Yeah, Substack's the best place. Just angeladenker.substack.com. It's I'm listening, and I'm doing a bunch of events around and scheduling more all the time. So would love to see some of you in person.
Cool. Angela, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Caleb. See ya.